Hello, I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to soldering equipment. And I wanted to show you here tonight, as you get a brand new soldering iron here and get it out of the package for the very first time, some of the soldering irons have a pre-tin tip. And even if they do, I like to re-tin the tip before I ever use it to make sure that it's got good coverage and a good tin surface, because this is critical to using the soldering iron in the future and making a successful solder joint. So I'm going to turn around here and I'm going to get onto my table cam here and show you some of the aspects of how to do the tinning process on a brand new soldering iron. So hang with me here and I'll switch cameras and turn around here to my table cam. Thing that we want to do here is we want to take the soldering iron out of the package. Remember, this is a brand new soldering iron that's never been used. This one actually has a pre-tin tip, and you can see maybe just at the tip here there's a little bit of a tinned surface there. But like I said, I like to always re-tin my tip, and I'm going to talk about that. So I'm using a lead-based solder here, and I'm using keister solder. I'll show you the solder that I'm using. This is a very common solder here. It's called 44 rosin core, and there are other solders out there. 60-40 solder is another very common one. It's 60% tin, 40% lead. Those are very common solders. This rosin 44 is actually a 60-40 solder here, and the diameter of this solder is a 0.031 inch. So it's a 31 thousandths of an inch, very small diameter, and that makes it very easy to control the volume and amount of solder. So I've got a piece of that solder here, and it's rosin core solder. We always want to use electronic solder. Never use acid core solder. Acid core solder is solder that is used in a plumbing application. So you don't want to use plumbing solder on electronics. It has acid that will eat away the electronics or the copper traces on the circuit boards and also the copper wires. So what I'm taking here is my piece of solder, and this is before I ever power this up for the very first time. And I just take that solder, and if I can hold it here on the tip, I just wrap it around the tip in a nice little spiral cone. And then what I do is I take this and I plug that in and let that melt off of there. And it will make sure to have something protective on your table there to catch the drippings, because it will drip off of there. And when it's done, then you will end up with this nice tin tip. And I'm going to show you on mine that I use all the time here that I've got a tin tip. I've got a tip cleaner. This is a little brass Brillo pad kind of looking tip cleaner that we actually take the tip and we poke it in there to clean off the tip. And as you can see, when I do that here, what I'm doing is I'm cleaning off the tip and cleaning off all the debris and any of the burnt on solder. And what you'll see here is you see this area down here that's been tinned on my soldering iron, and up here towards the end, the solder will actually, it'll never stick up here, because if I touch it up here, you'll see that it kind of balls up and kind of runs off a little bit. And down here, you'll see that it stays on there, and that gives us a nice molten piece of solder on there to help transfer the heat. Now, I don't need that much on there, and you'll see this will actually cook, and you'll see that the brown rosin will come out here. So that's what you'll be seeing here. So let me see if I can get that to focus on that part. Okay, maybe a little bit better picture here so you can see. So back here, we don't have any tinned tip, and this is actually the barrel of the soldering iron here. But if I touch back here, that solder doesn't really stick on there very well. But if I touch out here, you'll see that the solder on the very tip does stay there, and it's a nice molten ball of solder that will help transfer the heat. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to clean off my tip. I either drag mine or poke it in there. So sometimes poking it in there will clean it very nicely. Other times, and I've got a very used tip cleaner here, so it's kind of getting towards its end of its life. It doesn't clean as well. But you can see here my tip that I get is a very nice clean tip there. And then when we go to solder, what we want to do is we want to retin the tip or wet the tip. Okay, so we're going to put that little solder there on the end, and then that will help transfer the heat to whatever we're soldering. So if we're soldering on a printed circuit board, that will transfer the heat. If we're soldering on a electrical project, like for the circuit board here on the electrical terminals, we can solder with that. So that is the trick to preparing our soldering iron for the very first time. Now, when you turn that off and let that cool off, you'll see that that soldering tip will always have that nice tinned tip down there, and you are able to clean that off each time and retin that, so that that will make your soldering a little bit easier. So if you ever have a struggle to get solder to stick to the end of the iron and to transfer heat to anything that you're soldering, make sure to look at your tip. You may need to throw your tip away and buy a new tip and replace it, or buy a new soldering iron. Remember, our soldering iron is not a paintbrush, so we don't want to put the solder on the tip and then wipe it on the connection. We're using that wet tip or the retin tip here to transfer heat, so that the heat from the connection will melt the solder. We're not actually using the soldering iron to melt the solder on the connection. We're using the hot iron to heat up the connection, and the hot connection is going to melt the solder. Okay, so make sure to watch another video that I've got there on how to solder, and you'll see that process of making those electrical soldered connections. Thanks again, and let us know if you have any questions.